Shall I apologize for starting late? Or? Good evening. I am Richard Calvocoressi. I am a senior curator here at Gagosian in London. And a very big welcome to all of you for tuning in to this live discussion between myself and my distinguished guests, Dawn Ades and Martin Harrison. The occasion for this debate is the exhibition at our Davies Street gallery until the 23rd of April of Francis Bacon's painting Landscape with Pope / Dictator, circa 1946, which hasn't been seen in public for half a century. So it's a very exciting moment to be able to have a detailed look at this picture. And we've called the exhibition Francis Bacon, the First Pope, and it's simply a single painting in a gallery, which, as I said, is here for another couple of weeks or so. Now, my guests, just a brief introduction, first of all to Dawn Ades, who is a Professor Emerita of the History and Theory of Art at the University of Essex, author of a number of important publications on Dada and Surrealism in particular. She was the main curator of that great show at the Hayward Gallery in 1978-79, but also Salvador Dali, photomontage, Latin American art. But in this context, I think we're particularly lucky to have her because for the 1985 Francis Bacon retrospective at the Tate Gallery, she contributed the main essay to the catalogue. Martin Harrison is the foremost scholar of Francis Bacon now in the world, author of numerous books and catalogues on different aspects of Bacon's work, also photography, which of course has great relevance in the study of Bacon's work. But here again, I think the reason he's here tonight is he is the author, compiler of the Francis Bacon Catalogue Raisonné, which was published in 2016 in 5 volumes by the Francis Bacon estate. So I'd like to start asking Martin how, where, and when you rediscovered this painting, which you published in the Catalogue Raisonné for the first time.
Well, there are 584 paintings by Bacon in the Catalogue Raisonné, not a huge total. Over a third of those were already recorded in the earlier Catalogue Raisonné, published in 1964. And to find 500 is not so difficult. It's the last 84 that you're searching literally all around the world for. And by the time you're down to 10 that you've no idea, they don't seem to be recorded. In fact, the only reason I was even looking for this was that in the files of Miss Beston, Valerie Beston, who worked for Marlborough Gallery, I was working in some material one day and out slipped literally an A4 photocopy in black and white of what was clearly a Bacon with no other way of knowing what it was. But this Bacon exists. Where can it be? Well, someone once said to me, you're more like a detective, you're more like Sherlock Holmes than an art historian. And long story short, I found it would belong to a doctor in Milan, and he had died. It had never been shown. He had bought it, had been sold in Italy in 1954. He bought it in 1967. No one had ever seen it since. It was not reproduced anywhere. I had this very starved black and white photocopy to go on, but I just did a thing I often did. I started ringing people up in Milan and asking questions like this. Half the people must have thought I was a lunatic. But eventually I got on to the woman who owned it, sort of by luck, and I was thrilled. And I don't speak Italian, and I practiced my best Italian, and I had a little prepared speech. Buongiorno, I'm the author. And it was fine till she then threw a question back at me, and I clearly didn't understand, and she shouted at me, "Speak English!" So we took it up in English. And so I made an appointment. It was kept in a warehouse. She didn't like it. She only kept it because her husband had liked it. And I found my records. It was March 2014, less than 2 years before the Catalogue Raisonné came out, that we went to see it in this warehouse in Milan. so saw it in colour for the first time, as it were, as an oil painting.
And you linked it, if I'm not right, to a couple of letters that Bacon had written from Monte Carlo in 1946 when he was living there.
Yes, I mean, given this purely descriptive title, I related it to the painting that was descriptively called Landscape with Colonnade because it has a colonnade in it. And it's terribly interesting about the figure in the painting because it's got the papal biretta, but it's got a collar and tie. It's hence Pope stroke dictator. You could say even businessman if you wanted to preempt what Bacon hadn't started painting yet. And there were these two key letters. I think you mentioned it in the Gagosian catalogue. And on rereading it now, it's terribly interesting. It was on the same day he wrote both to Graham Sutherland, then his mentor, if you like, and certainly England's leading painter, so far as most people were concerned at that date, in the avant-garde, if you like, but also to his very sympathetic and intelligent gallerist, Duncan MacDonald, at Lefebvre Gallery, which was sort of Bacon's gallery at that date. On the very same day, he writes to tell both of them he's making these 3 sketches after Velazquez portrait of, you point out, you put sick in the catalogue. He calls it Pope Innocent II. He's taken some numbers away from him. I find on subsequent reflection, it's terribly interesting. He wrote to 2 people with that same information. And of course, they don't exist, except that when this appeared, it seemed to fit that bill, and I certainly think it does.
Maybe I could turn to Dawn. You, in the catalogue of the Tate Bacon retrospective in 1985, focused particularly on his interest in the open mouth as a key image in paintings of this period, but also carrying through subsequent decades, and quoted a number of sources, I think, for that image that's so important to Bacon. Can you say a little bit more about that, and also what it was like working with Bacon, because you knew him at that time?
Yes, indeed. Preparing the essay for the catalogue did involve several very happy conversations with Bacon and with David Sylvester. Though I can't say that he ever spoke very directly about that subject, it's actually very interesting to compare that catalogue, 1985, of the Tate retrospective, with more recent catalogues, because in that catalogue there's no chronology, no biography, and as Alan Bowness noted in his introduction to the catalogue, no commentary on the paintings, because the artist actually didn't want anything directly to be said about them. So, which is very interesting. I happened to have been working over the previous few years on a magazine called Document, which was edited by a sort of dissident surrealist, Georges Bataille. And we did have 1 or 2 sort of short conversations about this with Bacon. He did own it, and he read it. But we didn't talk in any more detail about why it might be significant. Anyway, I've been working on that and on Bataille, and I was struck by some of the similarities, not just in the images, such as the open mouth, but also in some of the ideas behind it, which seemed to me to chime really very closely with Bacon's attitude to the human and to the animal and to our experiences. So the open mouth, there's a particular photograph in Document by a surrealist photographer called Jacques-André Boisfoire of a screaming mouth. And I think that was one of the images that fascinated Bacon, though it was in black and white, and he spoke specifically of being fascinated by the colours of the open, screaming mouth, or indeed yawning mouth, one has to say.
Because he'd come across this book on diseases of the mouth in Paris, I think, as a fairly young man, which had colour, very sort of livid colour illustrations of some of these afflictions.
Yes, he did, and he seemed so. They weren't screaming mouths at all. They were mouths that were open for all sorts of uncomfortable medical reasons, and it was very sort of brilliant red and orange in the mouths. Yes.
And of course, one of the other sources was the Eisenstein film Battleship Potemkin, the image of the screaming nurse who's falling down the steps in
with
Odessa.
the broken glasses, with the
and
pince nez,
bloody
which also
face,
appear in some of the paintings. But
Yeah.
indeed, I think all these things came together, together with sort of popular imagery, like there's a kind of montage of photographs of people shouting, laughing and screaming, with animals screaming, laughing and shouting.
Yeah.
I think it was in Picture Post.
Yes.
And we know Bacon had that.
Sort of
and was fascinated by it.
fascist dictators juxtaposed with chimpanzees
Exactly.
or whatever.
Yes.
Martin, can you say anything more about
Well, this was,
his
you know,
knowledge
I
of
was-
Velazquez?
Well, I was going to
when
raise
would
that
you
point.
first come
because
across?
he says in the two letters we referred to MacDonald and Sutherland, it's based on Velazquez's painting. And everyone would agree. I think it's a fantastically powerful portrait of a not very sweet man, that Pope. And lots of reasons why that might have resonated with Bacon, especially if we're going to get biographical, his relationship with his father. But he wasn't screaming in the Velazquez portrait, and it's that, if you like, the open mouth, the scream. Because of really this talk, in a way, I've been thinking about it again, and you know, the distance in time, you can approach it in different ways. And I thought, what was the trigger? I mean, the one early thing that we know about, he knew Poussin's Massacre of the Innocents. And again, there are special reasons beyond just the Poussin painting and that the abject cry in that. And he knew that in the 1920s. I wonder, I don't know the answer. What was the trigger? And it's great that we have, through Dawn, this one, just to digress because I always do, it amazes me thinking back to your essay. That's the only erudite essay in his lifetime he ever allowed out. And as you've already alluded to, he wouldn't allow any descriptions of the paintings. The poor devils at the Tate who wrote rather good interpretations of things, he just wouldn't allow it. Mm. How on earth did you get away with this? You know, you actually are saying things about him that are not part of what he allowed in because he carefully controlled what was said. And yet you've got this amazing essay in there, and it got by him. How was this done? I'm astonished in retrospect. But
well, apparently he did read it before it was published. I mean, I think that was clear.
Yes.
But he wrote me this really lovely letter shortly before the exhibition opened, saying that that he knew it was almost impossible to write about paintings. You can't put it into words. But he said, but you have actually conveyed so much of what I want to do in the paintings, and so thank you for that. So it was a sort of imprimatur that there was something right about it. And I think it was, going back to Bataille, if I may for a moment, I think one of the things that Bacon really responded to was this sort of reversal of sort of values associated with the human. And so the cry, if one's crying, one is not, or shouting, or yawning indeed.
Or even laughing.
Or even laughing.
Hysterical
one is
laugh.
not speaking. Yeah. I mean, it's something that is much more instinctive and immediate and sudden. And I think that it's a sort of sudden reaction.
Yeah.
I think something like that, which somehow it says, you know, people perhaps at their most extreme moments of experience of one kind or another actually are not speaking; they are shouting.
Well, I think document really, the imagery in it. Again, it was you who showed us that he actually did know it. You'd expect he might. And bearing in mind how much he was in Paris, and now we know in more recent years how much he was in Paris, all those speculations I made was he must have been there in the early 30s. Well, we now know through his cousin that he certainly was. So he'd have been on the spot when these things were coming out, and though he didn't get to know people like Michel Léry till later, it was very much part of his culture, and so it's probably why he didn't mind you. If one thing would be exposed about his secrets, that's the one you might stand a chance with, I suppose.
What point did he meet Giacometti? Was that much later?
Do you know, there's a great story about that. We're going to psychoanalyze Bacon this evening at this rate. I'm sorry, I didn't know you were going to say this, and I don't have the exact date, but he was in the The south of France, I think, was with Peter Lacey, so it would be sort of 1953-4. And he wrote back, I think, to David Sylvester in London that he had been in a restaurant, open air, and Giacometti was at the next table, and he daren't go and speak to him. Bacon was sort of magisterial in his hauteur, and yet really humble and shy. I mean, that he embodied these contrasts, and this was the shy and modest Bacon. In 1953, he didn't think he was fit to go and speak to Giacometti, who he seriously admired. And he reports a conversation that he overheard. You know, he's listening to what they were saying, because Bacon spoke French, of course. And he said, he had quoted, I think it's to David Sylvester, Giacometti saying, "Oh, the English people go the colour of raspberries in the sun." So just a random insult that he threw out, which Bacon remembered and conveyed. But he must have had so much to say to him.
I'm just thinking about those early surrealist sculptures of Giacometti, you know, the very sadistic ones, like a woman with her throat cut, or those violent works that he was making in the early 30s, which in a way do seem to sort of prefigure some of the Bacons of the 1940s, like the three figures at the base of the crucifixion and so on.
Yes, I think you'd be completely au fait with those things.
But yeah, you would have seen reproductions of them.
You think, well, there's that must-have version of art history. It's not quite was, but we know it's was now, because he was always going off to Paris with his cousin in the early 1930s. So all those things you think he must have seen.
Yeah.
Well, he was there. I mean, still not proof he walked in through the door, but for goodness sake, he was trying to be an artist, so of course he would.
Can we go back to the Velazquez Pope? I mean, when would he have... He, as far as we know, he never went to see the full-length original in Rome. He would have known it only in black and white reproduction at that stage, and there wouldn't have been a colour reproduction, I imagine.
There wasn't. I'd worked that one out. I did first colour reproductions later. I don't remember the exact
He could have seen the one at Apsley House, the half-length,
yes,
in the Duke of Wellington's collection, because that went on show in 1947. So the year after the date that you gave for this picture, and it looks to me as if that picture is somehow behind Head 6, the Arts Council's what's normally referred to as the first papal image, which is 1949. So he, on one of his trips back to London from Monte Carlo, where he lived for nearly 4 years, I think, he could have seen that picture. But we don't know.
Well, okay, you've opened a can of worms, Richard, because what you're saying in effect is, and I've always been very interested in the Apsley House one for obvious reasons, but you want to circa 1946. Someone has recently criticised these datings, a scholar, and it's good to be able to refute his arguments. And he calls it the summer of 1946. Well, why be vague? Those two letters describing it were written on October the 19th. Yeah. I call that the autumn, but whatever. And then we know he's in Paris for most of November at the UNESCO exhibition where his painting 1946 was shown. And we know because of letters he seemed to be around most of November, and even talked of moving to Paris to move his studio there, which would push it back to December 1946 to finish it. Well, what if it was actually 1947? There's only a month's difference. Yeah. I mean, who's playing it? It says circa 1946. Yeah. And maybe it will be shown that circa 1947 is a better date. This then revolves around the fact that he said he wasn't good on dates in an interview. When I was in Monaco, and my framers had gone on holiday, and I ran out of canvas. So I turned the canvas round and worked on the unprimed side, found I liked the tooth of the canvas better for my way of using paint, and always I had all my canvases primed, but always painted on the unprimed side. Well, maybe that was 47, maybe it was December 46. He wasn't that accurate and reliable on dates. And, his framer was, there is one Head 2, the painting that's now in Belfast that he did in 1949. No one seems to have noticed it. It's stamped firmly on the back, his framer. They still exist. They were founded in 1900. They're called Maison Franco of Nice. And I went to see them. They're still there. And they framed for Soutine, Picasso, Chagall down there as well. So leading artists. And they were clearly his framers, the ones who did or didn't have a holiday and he ran out of canvas. But, 47, he remembered, it could have been the end of 46. It doesn't really affect dating this.
No, I think we were talking earlier before we went on air, that if you go through the catalogue raisonné for the 1940s, he's all over the place in terms of size of canvas, format, paint handling, subject matter. It's almost interchangeable in terms of dating. You can get something that you think might be late 40s, in fact, is much earlier, and vice versa. So it's very difficult to pin it down in that respect.
Well, but it would be the first appearance of not a colonnade, because we suspect the painting that is just descriptively titled Landscape with Colonnade. And there are other reasons with the marks on that canvas.
And is that certainly a sort of colonnade from a neoclassical fascist building like Albert Speer?
Well, this has been adopted as an idea.
Yeah.
No one wants to hide Bacon's various reasons for an obvious fascination with Nazi imagery, if not Nazism. But it is just a classical colonnade. And if you call this a dictator, then you can start saying, oh, well, there's references back to Hitler, Himmler, whoever.
Mussolini.
You can maybe over-egg that too, but there's clearly a colonnade there.
And
but
the microphones.
The Nazis' appropriation of classical architecture, I mean, it was actually established long before they used it. I'm not trying to denazify it either, but it's there's so many more complexities in that. I mean, one of the reasons that I dated it, a key reason really, was the presence of the cyclamen, which, if you're familiar with Monaco, you know they, to this day, grow in great profusion there. It's a very Mediterranean sort of flower. And they also appear in the directly related Landscape with Car from this same date. Now, I don't know, but I don't think anyone's linked that flower with the Nazi Party.
No, except
I could be wrong.
Dictators often had banks of
They
flowers, and probably still do, when making these, provocative speeches.
Yes, they do. And there's some great ones of Nazi speeches doing just that. I've got a collection of them. They're kind of source imagery for trying to look at Bacon's sources that I might use.
Dawn.
Well, the other thing, something that fascinated me about that painting were the flowers, indeed, as you say. And I thought something which I read in the book accompanying the exhibition that you also thought it, which is that the pink cyclamen also look like hands.
Yeah.
And they look like a crowd actually applauding, waving, clapping the dictator who is addressing them.
Yeah.
I thought that was so there was that side of it which sort of seemed to confirm the dictator side of things, but they're undoubtedly flowers. And the other thing, to my mind, the fascinating theme that runs through the paintings of this sort of period is the question of the senses. I mean, we've talked about the mouth and screams, which is sort of hints it, but the eyes almost never appear. Well, they do obviously here, but there is one painting, the Study for a Figure, where the figure is leaning right forward again, stretching the neck out and sniffing a bunch of flowers.
Yes,
though in fact it's wearing a mask, so it couldn't be sniffing them, which is quite strange. But so there's a sort of the idea of the senses being mobilised.
That's very interesting. I think that painting's in the Royal. Is that in the Royal Academy's current exhibition?
Yeah, it is.
It is. Yeah.
Yes,
It's from a private collection.
Yes.
But would this be, do you think, the first appearance of this sort of transparent box or cage-like structure?
Well, do you mean the more obvious, let's say, looking at it from here, the lighter
the sort
box? Because there's a sort of hidden one in the greys out in the background.
No, the one that's more foreground.
Yes. Yes, sort of. Under this challenge, this rather spurious challenge, it's good in the sense that you question everything, every assumption one has made about it, And I suppose technically, if you like, it could have been added later when it's back in London. I had a look at a very good scan of it before coming here today. And the fact that the biretta covers it doesn't mean to say it's not added last. He was always good at that sort of thing. It's painted slightly later. That might mean a day later, but it could be 2 years later. Who knows when he got it back to London, what he might have done with it.
Because he writes again to Sutherland at Christmas, just before Christmas 46, saying, I've nearly finished one and I'm really excited by it, which presumably would be the one we're looking at.
Well, presumably if that's the one, he destroyed so much. And I was speaking to Dawn before we came on air again, and she was just sort of confirming it is true that there's never been sight of the other two mentioned, well, certainly not, and this was the one, someone's tried to denigrate this as well, saying, well, he rejected it because he left it in his studio. But I may say he took it back to London too. That's a different gesture, If, let's say there were 3 that he got to a stage of completion, we can never know. This was the one he decided to take back to London, presumably rolled.
So there were about a dozen that he left in his studio in Cromwell Place. Is that right? Before Robert Buller took over the lease?
Yes. and they were bought by Piccadilly Gallery in 1953 because I think Buller got fed up of housing them, and all found their way pretty quickly to Italy. They're nearly all sold through Italian dealers.
And so where was Bacon in the early 50s? Was he in London then? Or?
Yes.
Yeah.
He was in the height of his affair with Peter Lacey, if you want to give him an excuse for taking his eye off the ball.
So his life was fairly, even more chaotic than usual at that point.
And he, after fleeing Cromwell Place, after the death of his nanny, which so deeply affected him, he was pretty peripatetic for a while. He was always moving studios. And borrowing studios at the Royal College of Art, for example. So yes, he was moving around.
So do we agree that there's something experimental about this picture? I mean, even transitional, that he's working out a number of different ideas that he would, in later works, focus on, exclusively, like, the open mouth screaming, whether screaming or laughing or crying, whatever, the papal form, the cage-like, box-like structure, which sort of isolates these figures, which you get right throughout, don't you, as far as I remember?
I think he was completely experimenting, and the cyclamen appear not in the way that fascinatingly Dawn just referred to. Hadn't occurred to me because I'm too stupid, but I love them being a cipher for a crowd. And in a painting that is destroyed but was recorded in a black and white photograph in 1945, they're kind of they're inverted cyclamen, really. But in none of these cases, I don't think, could you easily interpret them as a crowd. Here you could. And of course, the other key point that the flowers were being added. The painting you referred to, where the figure leans over and there's the roses on the side, which is a terrific painting. It is one of his 3 studies for figures at the base of crucifixion, which of course painted on relatively small fiberboard because you couldn't get canvas in the war. And this was a sort of big moment afterwards when canvas was available again. It's a lot bigger than those paintings, and it's just one panel. And it's not fundamentally different except for the flowers. And what Dawn referred to smell, I mean, because of thinking about this painting, I suddenly thought, you should do something about the flowers. Someone should just write out flowers, because it's a very short period, and yet flowers were important. What can this mean? What does he mean by this? Do you know, another thing, just thinking about Bataille, it was a reverse thing, as you know. I mean, he spoke about Bacon once, and in Tears of Eros, he shows the painting 2 figures from 1953, and talks about Bacon being one of the best painters. But I love, this is Bataille's greatest claim to fame, is the best description of Bacon ever. He talks about their brusque character. Isn't that a great description of Bacon? Brusque. I've never seen anyone apply that adjective. And it really applies to this in a way. This is not overworked, you know. He's got various ideas. You said he's experimenting. We've got these three main elements, you know, Pope, Dictator, whatever, flowers and colonnade.
It's a finished painting, I think. Would you not agree?
Yeah, I agree. But I also think it is very experimental. And there's something about the mark making at this point where you feel, although he obviously has, you know, the Pope and the colonnade and the cage and flowers, a certain amount of the mark making is quite ambiguous, ambivalent. And it could go one way or another way. And that's where, in a sense, he's sort of excited by what the possibilities of the paint are. And he allows chance and an experiment and accident.
Which was so important to
so important for him. So in a way, the pink, you know, okay, cyclamen, but, you know, there's just the possibility that it's something else as well. And that
whole thing of risk, and I mean, David Sylvester interviewing Bacon about his gambling, you know, because at this time, of course, the main attraction in Monte Carlo was not his painting. He was going to the casino every day and night, which is why he finished so few paintings, relatively. But I think David proposed this analogy between, you know, taking risk and accident in painting and the risk that he took when he was, you know, gambling at the roulette wheel.
Well, in the early years, when he wasn't making lots of money as an artist, he used to see the gambling as his job. I must go and earn some money. He didn't mean to make a great painting, to go and gamble and make the money. It's always struck me that having sold painting in 1946, the first museum sale, and it's now in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, of course, having sold that and got his 200 and something pounds, you'd think, well, and he always cited it as the absolute epitome of the way chance and accident work in his paintings. The biggest painting he'd ever done, biggest painting by an inch, I think, that he ever did. And this great moment, what does he do? Not sit in his studio and say, right, I'm going to be the great artist of the second half of the... He goes off to Monaco to gamble.
I think on that note, unless either of you have got anything else you wish to add.
I was only going to say there was a much earlier, 1933, again, great, wonderful painting, the Crucifixion, bought by Sir Michael Sadler, very important collector. Must have also looked as if he was well on the way to success. And what did he do? Went off to Berlin.
Yeah. And the leading collector of the day. I mean, Sadler's terrible. What a man to buy your picture. And he was in the Mayor Gallery, just over there. The Avant-Garde Gallery of England.
Alongside Art Now.
Great
Herbert Reed, and illustrated in Herbert Reed's book, Art Now, opposite a Picasso Bather's subject.
And yet the myth can be I was a late starter. Were you?
I think the only thing I wanted to add about this picture was the marvellous kind of violet blue colour tonality of it, which also looks forward, of course, to later works of the 1950s, but there's something quite haunting about, and when you see it in this very darkened space that we're now in, there's something quite magical about it. Well, thank you very much, both of you, for joining me in this very interesting discussion we've had about it, Dawn Ades and Martin Harrison, and thank you, the audience, for joining us too, and I hope you've had an interesting and illuminating evening. Thank you.